hold it. Okay. You ready?
Ready?
Okay.
I think everything's okay.
That's good. Good morning. I'd like to welcome all of you to our Assessment Roadshow. I'm Tom Saka from the Assessment and Accountability Branch. Excuse me. On behalf of Rodney Luke, our... Talk louder. Okay, sorry. I gotta talk louder. On behalf of Rodney Luke, our Assistant Superintendent for Office of the Strategy, Innovation, and Performance, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to get away from your schools to help us, to have a discussion with us on assessments. Actually, this is our fifth roadshow in like 7-8 days, but we saved the best for last, so I'm glad to be here on Maui. What I want to do before we start is recognize our assessment staff who've worked hard to put this together and spending the last week on the road. First of all, Karen Tohinaka, she's our coordinator for the roadshow thing. Who else is there? Paul Dumas, Brian Ryder, raise your guys' hand. Who else is around? Carol, Anton is someplace. Diane Murata's in the other room. If you have questions anytime throughout the day, these are the people you go and ask and they'll figure out. They'll be able to answer your questions. Today is not only about talking about testing that's required by ESSA or our summative assessments, but also trying to figure out how do we use these tests that we mandated to administer, how do we make it more valuable to what you do in supporting your school design and whatever you do, your instructional support for teachers. So we have breakout sessions today to talk about the assessments, how to do administration, security, accommodations. Similar to what you've heard in the past, this is just kind of a recap of how to make sure we administer the assessments properly. But also we have a bunch of sessions. We have people from OSIS, DGA to talk about how we use the results to inform instruction or assessment to inform learning. This is a big push from Deputy Superintendent Unim Basami, also the superintendent, the whole issue of school design and trying to push the decision making down closer to the students where you guys are able to better figure out what assessments to give. In fact, last night we spent 3 hours at HSTA talking about how do we kind of move to making that happen. So along that line of using the assessments more properly, we are very fortunate to have Dr. Ruth Wei from Stanford, the Stanford Center for Assessment, Learning, and Equity. For those of you, or SCALE, for those of you that don't know SCALE, they're a national leader in improvement of instruction and learning through the design and development of state-of-the-art performance assessments, which is something we want to move towards. Dr. Wei will be speaking on the topic of assessment in the service of learning, which kind of ties into how do we really make value of the assessment results. With that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Wei.
Thank you, Tom. And I'll try to speak up for those in the corner of the room over there. This is kind of expansive room. Let's see if I can get this on here. Good morning and aloha. And feel free if I ever drop my voice and I'm not projecting enough for you to kind of do the universal signal for if you can't hear. Thank you so much for your warm welcome. It's such a privilege to address you today on this beautiful campus in this beautiful island of Maui. I was stunned as I flew in to the airport at just how magnificent and gorgeous the landscape is. As Tom mentioned, I'm here from the San Francisco Bay Area of California. Do we have any California transplants here? Great, just a couple. We have pretty good weather, but definitely not as good as here. The water's a lot colder. So I've been blessed to live, study, and work at Stanford over the last 17 and a half years, probably the longest that I have been in any single educational institution. And for the last 10 of those years, I've served as the Associate Director for Assessment, Research, and Development at SCALE. So SCALE, as Tom mentioned, our primary mission has been to provide technical assistance to state departments, districts, and school networks that are committed to developing, piloting, and implementing performance assessments on a large scale. But as of January of this year, I actually made a career transition. I'm still working at Stanford as the director of a study of measures of social and emotional learning, but I'm also working as the new director of innovation and research at Envision Learning Partners, which works to advance the use of portfolio defense and performance assessment. And my role there will be to continue to do some research and development work in performance assessments with the goal of advancing best practices on a large scale. Before I start, I wanted to find out who's in the room so I can get a sense of you as an audience. If you are a classroom teacher, would you mind standing up if you have direct contact with kids on a daily basis? Great, great. Thanks so much for sacrificing your time with your students today to be here. If you're an instructional coach working with teachers to improve their practice, could you stand up? Great. Thank you. If you're a school-based administrator, and that might include an assessment coordinator, or maybe you may work with students in other ways. Like I know in another session there were some counselors. Other school-based administrators. Great. Anyone from a complex area at that level, administrator? No? Okay. Did we miss anyone? Technical support. Okay, is that you? No? Okay, okay. Technical supporters? Principals? Great, great, thank you. It's good to know who's here. Well, thank you all again for being here, and thank you for the tireless work that you're doing to serve Hawaii's youth. At this point, I'd like to ask you to turn to a neighbor and play a little word association game. And what I'd like you to think about is, what's the first word or phrase that comes to mind when you see this word? And it can be a visceral reaction, could be an emotion, or it could be rational. But the first thing, what's the first word or phrase? Go ahead. Share with your neighbor. Okay. All right. I would love to hear some of those ideas or words or phrases. So could I get 5 volunteers to just share out what was shared? You can just blurt it out, just shout it out, a word that or phrase that came to mind. Torture. Torture. Okay.
I stole that one.
Okay. Others? Burdensome. Okay. Anxiety. Data. One last one.
Know where my kids are.
Know where my kids are. Okay, great. So this is kind of the typical range of responses that I hear when I go around the country and I ask teachers, what do you think of when you think of assessment? Or more specifically, smart or balanced, what do you think of? And those are the kinds of reactions that I get. So today I want to talk about assessment in the service of learning. So being engaged in the work of large-scale assessment, in this case smart or balanced, I think we can all agree that assessment plays a critical role in monitoring and reporting on how students are doing so that school systems and teachers have the information they need to evaluate the effectiveness of their programs and their instruction. We also know that assessment plays, so that's in service of learning, We also know that assessment plays a pivotal role in the work toward educational equity and civil rights, for monitoring the progress of efforts to desegregate public schools and to improve the quality of education for African Americans as well as other traditionally underserved students, including indigenous populations, students with economic disadvantage, and multilingual students. Many people forget that the Elementary and Secondary Education Act originally was passed as a civil rights law to ensure equitable funding for students in poverty. However, if you talk to an average teacher today about assessment, they may give you a suspicious look and take on a defensive, stressed out, and even aggressive posture. In the last 15 years or so of implementing No Child Left Behind, all sorts of negative and fearful meanings have been attached to the concept and practice of assessment. Unfortunately, in many schools and classrooms, assessment has been used in a way that is punitive and stigmatizing for students, teachers, and schools as a way of labeling them as failing the standards. I can totally relate to this negative perception of assessment. Prior to arriving at Stanford as a graduate student, I was a secondary high school teacher in the New York City public schools at the beginning of an era in the late 1990s when assessment-based accountability was ramping up, when Regents exam scores and pass rates became the measure of my effectiveness as a teacher, and teaching to the test became a necessity and an obligation to my students who would need to pass a barrage of course exams in order to graduate from high school. On top of this high-stress, high-stakes assessment environment, my teacher credentialing program at Teachers College, one of the top education institutions in the country, failed to provide adequate preparation for me to how to use assessments productively to motivate and support student learning. I now see my fearful response to high-stakes testing by teaching to the test as educational malpractice. And I regret the extent to which I let the test take over how and what I taught. Eventually, the pressure of high-stakes testing pushed me out of the classroom after only 6 years of teaching. I bring this up because I believe we have, as part of the assessment industry, a Sisyphean task ahead of us of rolling the assessment boulder, so to speak, back up the hill to recover the tarnished reputation of assessment and to clarify the purposes of assessment so that educators, teachers, and parents no longer fear assessment, but truly understand its value for propelling learning forward. Let's face it, assessment has an image problem. So some of you might recognize that as Shrek. And it needs new representation. It's got a tarnished reputation. Assessment needs a redo, a makeover. And guess what? In light of recent federal policy changes, it looks like we might have a narrow window of opportunity to attempt a reset. Although I admit that a reset is a tremendous undertaking, I also believe that really productive and progressive educational change does not happen overnight, but that progress is made through incremental efforts and changes over time. This isn't just based on my own personal experiences, but on educational history. One of my first reading assignments in graduate school was the late David Tyack and Larry Cuban's book, Tinkering Toward Utopia. Some of you may be familiar with this book. It's a little bit dated at this point, but has some really enduring observations about educational reform in this country. In that book, Professors Tyack and Cuban observed that attempts at school reform are doomed in the short run and rarely have their intended effects. So that's kind of depressing news, especially for an idealistic graduate student starting their PhD program thinking they're going to save the world. The upside of this rather dismal conclusion, though, is that we can be sure that schools are evolving, slowly but surely. My family immigrated over 40 years ago from South Korea when I was 4 years old and moved into a neighborhood on Chicago's north side. Anyone here from Chicago? No? Oh, one person. Okay. Although I've been fortunate to have attained a high quality higher education. I have pretty miserable memories of my K-12 experience in Chicago public schools. So this was what my classroom looked like 40 years ago. That was probably me in the middle looking scared and bored at the same time. But when I visit my daughter's local elementary school in California, I'm actually quite buoyed to see how much progress has been made since I attended elementary school. I'm happy to observe that no longer do first graders in California, in first grade, sit in rows doing workbooks, reading primers, and memorizing facts and algorithms. Instead, they sit in circles on the rug in tables set up for group work, or stations with hands-on materials, in comfortable book nooks with beanbag chairs and colorful rugs, and spaces for imaginative play. They work on research projects, and they read and discuss literature written by actual authors. They write their own books, make presentations, and when possible, they make observations of the natural world. Like the slow and steady power of water carving the hardest stone, and we see lots of examples of that in Hawaii, I do believe there's hope for changing the way assessments are used in K-12 public schools in ways that propel learning forward. Like those slow and steady changes observed in elementary education, this kind of change won't be achieved by laws, regulations, and mandates. The advancements that I hope for in assessment will be achieved by school-level practitioners like you, working within policy constraints to use the limited time and resources you have to try out innovative practices and evaluate their impact on children. Those changes that we observed in elementary education didn't happen through mandates. It happened because there was a cultural shift in the consensus about what makes for a high-quality learning environment for kids and what it means for students to really learn. Although it may feel as though federal legislation has a tight grip on what you can do, the real power over what happens day in and day out in your school buildings lies in your hands. So how do we get there? How can we solve assessment's image problem and help educators and parents see the essential role of assessment in advocating for and supporting their children's learning? I want to share 3 big ideas about how we can advance assessment that is in the service of learning. These are lessons that I've gathered over the years as a teacher-educator, assessment developer, and researcher. The 3 big ideas are coherence, transparency, and agency. The first big idea that I want to share with you is coherence. From the beginning of the standards-based reform movement in the late 1980s, reformers and policymakers, including Jennifer O'Day and Mike Smith, argued that coherence is a critical component of standards-based reform in order to achieve its intended goal. Unfortunately, it appears that over the last 30 years of implementing standards-based reform, these reforms, as applied in the real world, have failed to live up to this imperative for coherence. Coherence calls for all components of the educational process, curricula, instruction, and assessments to be aligned with the standards that students are expected to learn. We need all pieces of the puzzle to be aligned to the same goals. Recently, my research team at Scale completed a multi-year study of project-based learning curricula in science and mathematics. The research question was whether a high-quality curriculum could in itself impact the quality of teaching and student learning. What we learned is not surprising, and it shouldn't surprise you either. The answer is that a quality curriculum is insufficient to drive effective teaching when educators are insufficiently prepared in terms of their content understanding and pedagogical practices. It's what teachers actually do with the curriculum materials and how they lead students to a deeper understanding of the content that matters. In this case, intensive professional development and collaboration was needed to align instruction with the intended learning goals of the curriculum. Over a 2.5-year collaborative process of of curriculum development, professional development, piloting, and reflecting. Most teachers in the project did develop the instructional repertoire they needed to use the curriculum well. But this level of teacher engagement and collaboration required significant time, resources, and facilitator expertise. Similarly, over the last decade of working with teachers to develop and pilot performance assessments, we have found that high-quality assessment in itself, in this case, performance assessments, are insufficient to drive quality teaching and learning if the users don't know how to implement the assessments in an educative way that supports student learning. As others have pointed out, taking more measurements more frequently doesn't make you grow taller, which is something that I probably wished for when I was a middle school student. Clearly, coherence, though a worthy goal, seems to be elusive or at best very costly and resource intensive. It requires a deep commitment of resources and expertise to invest not only in high quality curricula and assessments, but also in initial teacher preparation and ongoing professional development to prepare teachers to use those resources well. Given limited resources to invest, however, this does require that local districts make choices and prioritize what really matters in your context. So what should you choose? This is not a question that I can answer for you. It has to be a local decision. But a real commitment to invest in coherence will likely mean that some programs that are peripheral to the core mission of schools will need to be eliminated in order to prioritize what is most needed: improved curricula, instruction, and assessment practices. Professor Emeritus Ed Hartle, one of my favorite Stanford professors, argued that when evaluating the validity of an assessment, the opportunity to learn what is evaluated in the assessment is an essential aspect of validity. When students don't have the opportunity to learn what's assessed, this actually threatens the validity of the assessment. In other words, you can't properly assess what hasn't been taught. That's common sense. If we want large-scale assessment to provide a valid indicator of educational equity in order to advance equity, we must solve this opportunity gap. This will not be an easy undertaking, but coherence is one key step toward closing that gap, along with equitable funding and resources to build teachers' instructional capacity and retention. Teachers need to be equipped with a clear understanding of what is assessed in a summative test in order to design instruction that is aligned to state assessments. Does this mean that teachers should teach to the test? I will say a resounding no. Instead, teachers should attend to the full range of the content standards, including the disciplinary skills and practices, and at the cognitive complexity expected in the standards. This connects to my next big idea. Oops, go back. Transparency. Transparency is, in essence, a result of effective communication. We all know that in the last couple of years, there's been a full-on backlash against testing, especially related to testing time and frequency. I recently learned that Hawaii has eliminated the performance test components of the Smarter Balanced Assessment. You can understand that, and I understand that this decision stemmed from pressures to reduce testing time and cost. Given that my organization's central focus is performance assessment, you can imagine my personal disappointment. But setting that aside, you still have a high-quality assessment system assessed to the Common Core standards, which your state has adopted. Do educators and parents know what the assessments measure? Are assessment results communicated in a clear and simple way, but with enough information that educators know what to do next instructionally? Do they understand how best to prepare students to learn the content and skills measured in those assessments? If the answer to these questions is not a resounding yes, we shouldn't be surprised when parents choose to opt out, which more and more parents are doing, or when teachers leave the profession altogether, another unfortunate trend. Transparency matters. As a parent with inside track information about the Smarter Balanced assessments, which are also used in California, I've had the opportunity to listen to how my daughter's school principal and teachers explain the tests. It was clear that they had a fairly superficial understanding of the assessments and could only provide the broadest kinds of statements about what they measure or how the information would be used. This is understandable given the newness of the assessments and their online format. But now that the assessments have been implemented for the last at least 3 years, I believe it's time that educators became more expert in their knowledge of and their ability to explain the assessments to parents and students. Teacher and parent education about the tests has to include more than broad statements about what the tests measure and links to access the tests online. If we want teachers and parents to fully understand what these tests measure and their value for propelling their children's learning forward, we need to give them opportunities to have conversations with administrators and teachers who deeply understand the measurement goals and the information that can be learned from them. We need to emphasize the value of the information that can be derived from the test results and how we use them to make adjustments in the school program and to instruction. And last, we need to communicate the results in ways that teachers, parents, and students can make sense of and act on. But you may ask, how do we get teachers invested in wanting to understand the new assessments and to analyze the results, to reflect on how to address learning gaps? This brings me to my last big idea, agency. Why does it seem so hard to get teachers positively engaged in the assessment process? This is a nationwide cultural issue and a motivation issue. For so long, teachers have been left out of the assessment process in many places across the country. Instead of being involved in the assessment process, teachers have become the victims of assessment. Assessment is something that is being done to them, even as they serve as assessment proctors and are held responsible for their results. Like students dreading to learn what they got on a math test or the results of your health screening, educators fear what the test will say about their students' learning and, by extension, about them. At the same time, they feel disrespected by policymakers and others who just don't understand why they can't just raise their kids' test scores. When we forget that teachers are persons and professionals with their own goals and motivations, when we expect teachers to simply comply and implement assessment policies, no questions asked, this results in a dehumanizing culture that eventually pushes teachers out of the profession. In my work with teachers, working in a variety of contexts, in large districts like New York City and in small districts with only a handful of schools, teachers have been involved in the development, piloting, and scoring of assessments. Through a collaborative partnership arrangement, these teachers are invested in the assessments because they feel they have a voice in determining their content and design. They feel involved in making design decisions, and they own the rationale of those decisions. Also, when they're involved in determining how to score the assessments, the scoring criteria, and have a deeper understanding of those criteria used by engaging in a common analysis of student work with other teachers, they develop a deeper understanding of the assessment's measurement goals and how to prepare their own students. In a recent project with WestEd called BEAL, Building Educator Assessment Literacy, which some of you may have actually participated in over the last couple of years, Scale and WestEd developed a set of turnkey professional learning modules for teachers in which they learn how to score the Smarter Balanced performance assessment tasks. Through conversations with other professionals while applying the rubrics to analyze student responses, teachers deepened their understanding of what the assessments measure and were more likely to see the Smarter Balanced assessment system as a worthwhile assessment of their students' learning. Evaluation results from, and this is from Oregon, indicated that 84% of participants agreed that the experience deepened their understanding of the Common Core standards. One Oregon math specialist responded in an interview, "There's a lot of bad press out there about the Smarter Balanced Assessment. And I think that once people take the time to learn about it, they realize that, oh, well, this is really going to be a good measure of what my students know and can do." Another participant, learning specialist Rena Wagner, responded, "What has come out of being a part of the Beal project is that I know what is being looked for and what kids need to know, and I've now been able to find curriculum that matches that." In addition, the Beal Professional Development asked teachers to reflect on the implications of what they learned from student work for their own instruction, and to share strategies and plans for helping students develop the disciplinary understanding, skills, and habits needed to master the standards. This allowed teachers to understand the importance of using the results of the assessments to determine next steps in their instruction. These kinds of experiences were key to building teachers' sense of agency and ownership over assessment by becoming actors in the assessment process rather than passive recipients of an assessment policy. We need to work on rehumanizing the way that we invite and motivate teachers to be powerful agents in the assessment process, and we need to redesign school cultures in order to create the conditions and provide the supports and experiences they need to be powerful agents over their own professional learning and their students' learning. Likewise, many students generally have a negative association with large-scale assessment and assessment in general. In an essay published in an anthology called Talking Back: What Students Know About Teaching, high school junior Eleanor Gerber-Stiff expressed her dismay over the testing culture in her Bay Area school. Students quickly learned that the most important factors in determining their success in life are grades and test scores. When I was in 4th and 5th grade, my elementary school eliminated physical education from our schedules in order to cram more time to study for standardized testing that came every year. I can understand why. The school received funding based on its test scores compared with other schools in the Southeast. It becomes a vicious cycle in which teachers gear their curricula towards standardized tests instead of creating a passion for learning or even teaching content beyond the standardized testing. This student actually sounds pretty engaged in her schooling and in her desire to succeed academically. She has the ability to think critically and express her own ideas passionately. But what about the students who aren't buying it, who disengage from the schooling process because of this test-driven, grades-driven culture that they feel they have no control over and that tells them that they are failing? How do we convince such students that assessment can actually propel their learning forward? Paul Black and Dylan Wiliam are well known for their ideas about assessment for learning. Some of you may be familiar with their seminal article, Inside the Black Box. In that article, they describe an important core set of principled and research-based assessment practices that actually do propel learning forward. In particular, they discuss the importance of students' self-assessment and its role in metacognition, motivation, and learning. Without an accurate understanding or awareness of their own learning progress, students won't know where to go next in their learning. Like their teachers, bringing students into the assessment process can help them gain ownership of their assessment results and a greater self-awareness and agency. I'm currently directing a study examining students' development of social and emotional learning. In one of our study schools, we're working on developing ways to gather evidence of student agency. We can tell that students don't have ownership over assessment when they say things like, "I'm sorry, I forgot to do your assignment," or "I didn't like the grade you gave me," rather than, "How can I earn a better grade?" How do we get students to take ownership and feel that they have control over the assessment process? One strategy that we're developing involves having students become more self-aware by conducting their own strengths analysis. What are my strengths? Where am I improving? And where do I still need to grow? Then they set goals for themselves. For example, my goal is to improve my ability to have a clear thesis in my writing. Then, with the support of their instructor, they determine the next steps that they will need to achieve their goal. For example, I will study examples of writing that has a clear thesis. At the end of the unit or project, students then self-assess. Did I meet my goal? Did I complete all my steps to achieve my goal? I recently learned about a study conducted by a Bay Area startup company, Sown to Grow, which measured the impact of a strategy to increase students' agency and ownership over their own learning. These students were asked to engage in the simple act of inputting their own assessment scores into an online record rather than downloading or retrieving an existing record from a learning management system. They were then asked to reflect on their scores and on their progress. The researcher found that those students were more likely to report a greater sense of ownership over their learning than comparison group students. So what role might large-scale assessment play in developing students' agency with respect to their own learning? If scores on summative and interim assessments can be reported in an analytic way that is simple, easy to understand and interpret, they can actually be shared with students themselves in a way that enables them to use the results to build greater self-awareness, conduct a strengths analysis, and identify areas for growth. They could then work with their teachers and parents to work on those areas, set their own goals, and identify steps for reaching their goals. They could monitor their own progress toward completing those steps and know where to continue to seek feedback and support. The goal is to put students back in the driver's seat of their own learning. Maybe this seems like a pipe dream. Students engaged in the assessment process? That seems far-fetched. I want to share a short video of a student who recently graduated from an Envision school. This is a group of charter schools that I now work with as the Director of Research and Innovation. Although the types of assessment used in Envision schools, which involves a public defense of a portfolio of performance assessments, it's very different from large-scale assessment. But I think this work provides a window into what happens when a school culture is designed to encourage students to have ownership over the assessment process. As you watch the video, I ask you to notice ways that the school staff sets students up to have greater agency in the assessment process. So let's see if I can get this to work.
Being prepared academically to do deeper type approaches, not just to be able to complete a test, is the foundation. But students need more than that, especially first-generation college-bound students. They're going to need to be able to feel empowered through their experience in high school to be able to contribute to the dialogue that's going on. That's the reason why our students graduate by performance, by creating a portfolio of college-ready work, then having to defend that, to give an academic-style presentation and field hard-hitting questions from their teachers, administrators, even peers at a highly proficient level in order to graduate.
Welcome, everyone, to my graduation portfolio.
The defense looks like students standing in front of a panel of teachers, community members, students, family members, and they present 3 artifacts that they've revised to proficiency. Then they use their artifacts that are their best work and their reflections that they've done in each subject area, and they come up with a presentation that proves that they're ready for college-level work.
So this is a good example of how I've gotten better in my academic identity over my high school years. I do more research, and I have credible sources that back up my actual evidence.
One of the pieces that students have to defend is an inquiry piece. It could be scientific inquiry, it could be a social sciences inquiry, it could have lots of forms.
Hey.
Hello.
Hey, Suema.
I need help, actually, from both of you.
Tiana's going to be presenting her lab report that she wrote up for the Gulf oil spill lab. And so the major components that we're looking at are scientific method and just looking at ways that she utilized that as a problem-solving technique for the question, hypothesis, procedure, data materials, data collection, and then conclusion. And we'll be showing her learning of that process around the oil spill.
What actual method works the best?
The paper towel method.
My role as advisor to Tiana is to really coach her through this process. She has a list of things that she needs to do: revise artifacts, create her philosophy of education, do her subject area reflections, and I am sort of overseeing that whole process.
Yep. I have a question.
Yep.
So, is it just the artifacts that need to be certified before you go, or does everything up there, including note cards?
Everything needs to be certified.
Everything
One thing
needs to be
isn't certified,
You
then you
can't
can't go.
Right.
What about the defense pass? Or
When are you going to start practicing? Once you have the majority of those things, of the stickers put up there?
you have to practice 3 times before you can.
Absolutely. Really, it's me sort of asking questions from her and gleaning information so that together we can build this presentation that's really going to convey her mastery of knowledge, application of knowledge, and reflection. So do you feel like your introduction, I mean, were there word choices that you used?
Oh, definitely. I feel like that was like the strongest part of my cover letter. I literally worked on this all day yesterday.
They are going through and really making their work college level. And the teachers hold a really high expectation. And we get to hold students accountable for really doing their best work.
The students feel really stressed out about their graduation portfolio defense. Sometimes they're staying up until 1 o'clock in the morning, many nights in a row, and I feel good about that. I think they should be stressed out about doing the culminating event of their high school career. I think it is doing justice to their education that they have to show what they know and where they're headed in a defense before they go on to college.
So, Tiana, we're going to ask you to resubmit, and most of it is based on the presentation. Your content is there. It didn't come out as much as we know that you know. Okay.
We find that failure in graduation portfolio defenses is an extremely positive experience for the most part. When students don't pass their graduation portfolio defense, they resubmit and resubmit again until they actually pass.
Really, we push the kids, and we're committed to getting them to this point where they can graduate. And so, not in our 4 or 5 years of doing this have we had a student just not succeed.
My educational philosophy is one that has developed over the course of my high school career. And I feel that in order to be an educated person, you need to know your self-worth and be the best version of yourself possible.
Tiana, congratulations, you're fast. Tiana, I'm so proud of you. You're persistent. You want to do the best work that you can, and I think that that's going to serve you in college.
So just tell Grandma that I passed. Okay, love you too. Bye.
Hey. Congratulations.
Thanks, baby brown already.
So, where was it? Okay. So seeing students like Tiana, who is actually a first-generation college goer in her family, all of her older brothers had dropped out of high school. Seeing students like this being fully engaged in the educational and assessment process is so refreshing to me. What I hope you noticed is that while students are expected to meet rigorous and demanding expectations for graduation, the school provides a really deep reservoir of support and mentorship to students to achieve those expectations. This is challenging and really demanding work for both students and their teachers. But when adequate supports are provided, and there's a culture that supports revise and resubmit, revise and resubmit, revise and resubmit until the student succeeds, students and teachers are willing to step up to the challenge. So I want to leave you with 3 big questions to ponder as you process what you're learning through the rest of today and when you're driving home. First, how can we work toward a more coherent system of curriculum, instruction, and assessment that provides all students with opportunities to learn? And by extension, what do we need to let go of so that we can focus on providing high-quality curriculum and instruction that serves all students? Second, how can we more transparently communicate the purpose and uses of assessment in a way that helps educators, parents, and students understand assessment in a positive light as a means to propel learning forward? And last, how can we build teacher and student agency and ownership as full participants in the assessment process? I know these are not easy questions, and I certainly don't have the answers to all of them right this moment. These are questions that you'll need to ponder and reflect on as you work in the daily work that you do with students. But I want you to remember that that change that we saw, like in elementary education, happened over decades. And this is not to say that this will necessarily take decades, but it does require this kind of cultural shift to happen in schools. It requires really building capacity among educators to do this kind of work well. Like they say, a journey of 10,000 miles starts with one step. So thank you again for being here and for the service that you provide to the kids in your communities. Thank you.